this session will not follow the usual pattern that I take sessions in. So my sessions are usually very structured. So it's like, what is this? This is these 4 things and a bunch of examples with a lot of emotions. But this session is not going to be about, like, it's not going to follow that rubric. The reason for this is that this is essentially a rant. This session that I'm taking, the reason why I'm taking this session is essentially stems out of the fact that I've been in many ways where the things that were being talked about were just nonsensical. So, and I've been like, the word rejoicing, that I just feel like after a point, the circuit is just like memorizing stuff and regurgitating them in rounds. It's like they have heard this stuff at some point in their life, some good debater has made this argument, they have memorized it, they have seen another good debater make this argument, they have made this argument at some point in their lives, and then maybe listen, and they realize, oh, this is a good argument, so then they keep using it. So, yesterday, when I shared the Facebook post regarding this workshop, I actually used to example. Minority children are not like ambitious, or minority communities or parents are usually try their children to go to. So, these are arguments that I have heard at least, I'm not going to exaggerate, at least 10 to 12 times. And I'm not sure how true these are. But the problem is, I don't even want to blame people, because people are essentially a product of their environment and everything that they've seen and learned, right, from other people and other sources. What has actually happened is that argument idea they have like some truth to it, okay? They have some truth to it at some point. Maybe there was a lot more substantiation with the argument that they're presenting right now, but unfortunately, the repetitively used at the unnuanced way, and unfortunately, no one puts in any thought. So, like the example I use, this now is that so on it, the repeat motion, like stop motion. This now feels that children of minority communities should seek success elsewhere rather than their community. So, in simple bhasha, if you're a child from a minority community, the idea is that you should not stick to your community or the place that you grew up in or have been brought up in. You should probably move somewhere else, where community safety and security and comfort and you should seek success there. You should try to find a career or do whatever you want elsewhere and not within your community. And the argument that I constantly keep hearing under these motions is that, oh, minority parents don't necessarily want their children to go elsewhere, or a child and children to live as Chicago, because oppression, discrimination, blah, blah, so they want their children to stay close to them. But after a certain point, it doesn't even make sense, okay? So, I am not saying that there is absolutely no merit in these ideas, but the merit has been lost in translation and in repetition. And even like the ones who are newly beginning to debate, the argument will be unnuanced version and this might be like there might be points where you go like, oh, this is an argument, this is a good argument, I should learn it, I should use it the next time. So I really don't want this to happen, and that's essentially why I'm taking a session on this topic. Okay. So before we move on to the session, what is a marginalized community? Actually, minorities, marginalized community. Because marginalized community and minorities do not mean the same thing. Because minority will also check the quantitative idea. It's like people who are in numbers. But actually, it should be marginalized community. That is, marginalized community should be minority because it's easier to flag. Because minority should be not use the word what it really means. Marginalized community is a bit more, what is a marginalized community? But does everyone understand what marginalized communities mean? Anyway, just, what does it mean? Anyway.
People who are disconnected from the mainstream.
Disconnected from the mainstream. Asha. Anyone else?
Oppressed and
Anyone?
Systematically prevented from
okay, systematically. you have debated, I have a follow-up question to ask you. What do you mean by systematic? Because it might sound like a buzzword to some people. So what do you mean by systematically? In debates, after the debate start for it, you might hear this term, we just started. So from after start, this is not working. So, like, you will hear this word a lot, systematic oppression. So, what is systematic?
The structures of society and
structures of society.
the culture, norms, and beliefs.
Cultural norms and beliefs. Acha. Anything else?
Laws.
Laws, exactly. Policies, laws, cultural norms, beliefs. So, things that constrain people's choices, right? Things that bound people to like very limited choices. And things that bound people to very limited choices, whether it's through cultural norms, social norms, policies, laws, whatever it is. So it was system that action was systematic oppression. So don't feel bad, I'm not calling for TV because my priority is you, okay? My priority is to make this sound as simple as possible and non-debate jargon and terminology times. So marginalized communities do not necessarily have to be minorities. So for very common example, two common examples. Anyone? Or you can have a picture of it. I might be one of them.
Woman.
Exactly. A woman could be like women population could be a marginalized, could be thought of as a marginalized community because once again they face systematic oppression or discrimination. But we are not a minority. We often in a lot of societies and countries, we actually are like 50% of the population. So we are in no means a minority. But what is a minority that is not a marginalized community? Okay, what is a minority that is not a marginalized community?
The 1%.
The 1%, exactly. I actually have another example. So I will use my notes a lot. I hope that's not distracting. But did you raise your hand? Oh, sure. Just a second. Yeah. So the 1% are essentially people who are rich, people who are at the top of the economic section. This is very distracting. Do you want me to pause for 1 minute?
More people.
Oh yeah. Okay. 1% chhara are for example a minority that is not a marginalized community. Two country specific example of the world.
At the risk of sounding weird, Zionists.
Oh, okay, Zionists. But I'm not sure if they are a minority. I'm not sure if in the US.
Globally they are.
Globally, yes, could be. Yeah, definitely. Anything very similar, I take example as well. Huh?
They're marginal.
They're marginalized. They're very marginalized. So, Native Americans, they have also. Yeah, they are incredibly, অনেক painful history আছে. But they were essentially the ones who originally belonged to the USA. And ওদের land, ওদের against genocide to USA. I don't know if I should say anyway, but these are like basic history facts. I'm not sure if this the basic really right. Whatever. I example of the South Africa there, the white population. I think they make up like 13% of the population, but they own like 70% of the land. So they're a minority, no? Yeah. It's so shocking. Yeah, they're 13. I might get the statistics wrong. I might get some of the percentages wrong, but they're like roughly. You can look it up actually. They're like 30% of the population, but they own like 70% of the land. So definitely not a marginalized community. In fact, ওদেরকে দিয়ে অনেক নাটক হচ্ছে। So ওদের থেকে land our government নিয়ে নেওয়ার চেষ্টা করতেছে currently, but that is being politicized by people like Elon Musk, who actually comes from South, like African African family. I think his parents owned like emerald mines. So obviously they were definitely the people who committed genocide against the Black South Africans, also Donald Trump. So I think earlier this year, Donald Trump very enthusiastically welcomed a lot of South African migrants, immigrants. And it was oh, they're being oppressed, their homes are being taken away, blah, blah, whatever. Okay, so they're a minority, but not necessarily marginalized. So what I'm trying to prove is that marginalized communities and minorities are not necessarily the same. This workshop is necessarily about marginalized communities, so they don't necessarily have to be minorities. I take example just okay, this workshop will have a lot of examples. Like I said, this workshop will not contain the usual rubric that I have for my sessions, which are very, very structure heavy. So it's discussing something, explaining what the thing is, and then breaking it down to a few layers, and then using examples for those layers. But a workshop that will have more examples rather than a lot of substantiation, okay? Because I feel like that's something that people need more urgently. So our example of the project, have you guys heard of the Rwandan genocide? Rwandan genocide, so there's genocide, and Hutus and Tutsis. They are two major ethnic populations of Rwanda, and there was a genocide against the Tutsis. But the thing is, Tutsis actually happen to be greater in number. So their population happened to be greater in number in Rwanda when the genocide, sorry, it was not a genocide, more suddenly I don't know the terminology, but the thing is, the genocide that we know, so it's for example, Gaza, or Umar, Nazis, it happened to be very, it happened to take place over a very long period of time, or a substantial period of time. I think the Rwandan genocide was a bit more short-lived, but it was definitely incredibly bloody and but it's, did you raise your hand? So yeah, that's why it's called Rwandan genocide. But yeah, suddenly, of course, there were political and ethnic tensions in between the two groups. And I think at a president assassinated for a person, and that's when I looked up for it. There was a very sudden, sporadic episode of killing across the country. But the thing is, the people who had to be fewer in number were the ones who were responsible for it, not the other way around. I hope no one walks away from this session. Okay, I was going to make a joke, but let me not make that joke.
Make it.
No.
It's on the rendering.
Yeah. I'm not going to make the joke. So, I think I explained why I'm going to take this session. Now, let's start with what I have here. So, a very common misconception when everyone starts reading is that, oh, we need to do research. But what do we do research about? International relations. We do research on Russia, we do research on China, we do research on the US. But people often never read up on things like feminism. They often never read up on things like social movements, which is very detrimental. Trust me, actually, they say, if you're in a good group, it's very easy to figure out who has done some research, who actually knows some things about the motion, and who doesn't. So after a certain point in your debate career, you absolutely need to do things like reading up on social movements and feminism and things like that. Also, this workshop will not necessarily just be about marginalized community. It will be about characterization. It will also be about debating. Orientation comes forward. Again, that's why I said this will not follow my usual rubric. Okay. So, I listed a few things. Now, I like this newspaper in particular. I actually dislike this newspaper. But the thing is, and for obvious reasons, for ideological reasons, they are essentially they're the media piece for white people, white Americans. Okay, but I have yet to find yet another newspaper who does as much extensive coverage, that too on a weekly basis. So economics there, comparatively going white imperialist, propaganda news for national picture, how Zorana, good, actually, they published an article that said the places where Zorana Mamdani got the least amount of votes happen to be the places that actually look like America. Sorry, so that implication. There's white dominated neighborhoods, they're the ones who obviously voted less for Mamdani, and that's the neighborhood that actually looks like America. And also about Gaza, there are so many headlines that you can think of how they were so disgustingly they were just discussing, right? The thing is, our teacher custom. So if you want to avoid those pieces, which you obviously know are from a very biased point of view, start reading The Economist from the bottom up. So economists সবচেয়ে সুন্দর আমরা কভারেজগুলো হচ্ছে on things like music, art, তারপর হচ্ছে scientific field কি হচ্ছে, তারপর হচ্ছে খুবই নিশ জিনিসপত্র নিয়ে ওরা মানে like actually করে. So ওদের নিচের সেকশনগুলো হচ্ছে on the more niche topics of the world, and উপরের গুলো হচ্ছে তোমার IR, ওদের যত ধরনের political ideology push করা আছে এগুলো হচ্ছে উপরে থাকে, আর actually enjoyable or like stuff that you otherwise probably won't get as easily on other places, which you need to take back. I can show about the economists that their structure of writing is very beautiful. So again, I do not for obvious reasons, but at the same time, like I usually joke about this, like they're making it very hard for me to love them. So their structure of writing. I personally, this is my personal opinion, people can disagree on this. I personally believe that it really helps reading. So their article like that's like really helpful to a thought process that you probably want to inculcate it within yourself for reading. So I personally, I'm not sure people who check out what that exact structure is with their articles, but it's just really good. Like if you keep reading economist articles, it's something that really helps you think about stuff better. So when it's thought process stuff, that's really good. I'm just personally know. And I'm pretty sure you guys have seen this on Instagram. Like I think there are 15 new newspapers like for the past 4 or 5 years, but they specialize on the South Asian news, and they're pretty good. So we're not just South Asian, we're diaspora, also big news. It's about feminism and LGBT newspaper. Sorry. I think we should share. Yeah, I just said it won't be a bigot. It's probably harder done than said. Sorry, harder done than said. It's easier said than done. The thing is, I'm not going to claim that every single person who comes up with a bad argument is necessarily a bigot. Obviously not. But sometimes it can get so weird and borderline offensive that I cannot help but wonder, okay, that's interesting. Why would this person think of such an argument? So the thing is, I'm going to joke for it won't be a bigot, but I also feel like I'm a debate language. So my friends and I we often use this debate land. What does debate land mean? Debate land is a hypothetical imagination land. Certain things that are usually said and usually believed and usually approved of do not necessarily have a lot of connection with reality. Like sometimes, I cannot think of an example of the top of my head, but there are some arguments widely approved of, probably not the most realistic, and it's usually done or it usually happens because debating is an activity. It's not necessarily like a discourse for a place. You think thoroughly, you talk with different kinds of people to take their opinions. It's essentially a sport. You get 15 minutes, you come with a bunch of stuff, you say those stuff in any way that will help you win. So we often detach ourselves from reality. So ideas sounding weird, okay? So I guess this is a precursor. I'll start with the lecture. So what are some debate land stereotypes? Number one, marginalized communities at a monolith. Monolith will be in chat. Anyone? Monolith.
A singular symbolizing.
Exactly. Like it's one whole block. So the marginalized community, they're just, I don't know, there's this whole thing. There's like very few dimensions to it. It's one big chunk of something, and there's very little nuance in it. It are unfortunately more stereotypes. And obviously, the reason why I'm calling this a stereotype is because it's not necessarily true. So once again, I'll just give a bunch of examples that might help you with things. So minorities and marginalized communities, how do their experiences differ? One very simple example, one very simple factor, economic privilege. So economic privilege, economic privilege or currently, my experience as a woman, sometimes, like, okay, not sometimes, I'll be very honest, most of the times, is a lot better than, for example, my maid who works in my house, right? We are both women. We both suffer from patriarchy, but my experiences of women, despite how much sexism or despite how much misogyny I have to face, even in my educated circles, it's still a lot better than stuff that, for example, my maid has to suffer throughout her daily life, right? So, and this is the same for even religious minorities. So I, as a Hindu person, living in Dhaka city, going to Brack University, and having attended an English medium school, which also happened to be a Christian missionary school, my experience as a Hindu or a religious minority is very different from, for example, a Hindu person in a village. So, and this is something that I try to keep in mind, and this is something that I try to take into consideration even when I'm speaking out on behalf of my community. So after I was working in an NGO, and I think American friend posted, oh, this was right after 2021 Durga Puja, right? So we were thinking of some content, and someone was like, oh, okay, you should probably make a piece about like your experience of being a woman, like a piece of woman about. And I was like, no, I decline, because I do not think my experience, despite the kind of stuff that I see, like, okay, like I'm not saying that I live a very pushy life. Even in January, আমাকে নিয়ে একটা hate crime করার Facebook page posted someone. So they literally just opened a Facebook page, they were sharing my posts and my photos, and they were just giving slurs use in the captions. So these are stuff that I face. But I still think that if there were to be any room or space or opportunity for like a person from a religious minority background speaking up about their experience, I should probably not be the one taking that space up. So because I do happen to live a much better life than what they do. Okay? So another example, which for example in India, the kind of oppression that Muslims face. For example, Shah Rukh Khan does not face the same kind of oppression, even though I'm pretty sure he still faces hate crimes and microaggressions. But in comparison to, for example, a worker from a Muslim person from Bihar who works in, for example, in construction. So there was a very heartbreaking story. And so I think a few years ago, and I think it's still happening. So the Indian government is trying to create a registry, like an all-national registry for Indians and for basically Indians. And the people who will not be able to prove that they have to be Indians or their documents lie, or they get into camps about like big ass camps, like actual camps. And the people who are making them happen to be Muslims. And they also happen to be people যাদের certain documents, like অনেক documents government documents which ask for, receive for from people. So ওরা বলছিল যে no, our forefathers they migrated, and তখন হচ্ছে এরকম official documents কিছু নাই আমাদের কাছে. And the sad irony was that they were the ones building those camps, and he said it himself. I very well could find myself in this camp, after a few years. So if you compare, for example, the Khans of Bollywood, I'm pretty sure even they face microaggression. But if you compare their living experiences with someone like the one that I used, probably very different, right? So again, why? Because of economic privilege, right? They're rich, they're loved, those are basically it. So again, just keep this in mind.
There were exceptions cannot be an example.
So
Here's a better example.
I would not call that an exception. I would rather call it a spectrum. So we all know what a spectrum is. A spectrum is a continuous thing, so it's not necessarily black and white. So you're either oppressed or you're not. It's like a spectrum. So oppressed, less oppressed, less oppressed, a little more oppressed, a lot more oppressed. So and probably economic privilege is the one that determines it. So it's the same for me. I face really shitty stuff, But at the same time, I believe that I am a lot more privileged than a lot of the people who are living in the same country and are suffering due to the same factor, such as religion, so I took an example for it, gender, right? So we could be talking about the same ethnic minority, religious minority, but based on gender, their experiences might be very different from one another. Okay. What could be an example? Probably black women and black men. So the kind of problems that they usually face can be very different. So what do black women face problems? So what are the kind of problems? So very common problem could be fetishization, right? So fetishization could be, and I don't know if you guys know this, tell me more. Fetishization is not necessarily a positive thing. So one might intuitively think, oh, fetishization, that should be something that's positive because they're admiring it. That's not the case. Fetishization is actually a form of dehumanization. So when you fetishize someone, you see them less as a human being with nuance, with a wide range of factors to them. It's more about an idea. Oh, it's like an imagery. It's like a fantasy. So it's not necessarily seeing that person as a human being. It's more like an idea or a fantasy in your head, and the lens you use to see them through. So fetishization is not necessarily a good thing, a positive thing. It's actually a negative form of. Okay, sorry, I'm on illustration. So it's negative. But before I come to the very specific example of black people, I'm going to change guys. So I'm also very sorry, I'm going to make started. So before I come to the very specific example of black people, let's just think of non-white people in the US, or non-white females in the US. So suppose Latinas, black women, Asian women. So all of them, on some varying degrees, probably face things like fetishization, right? But even within that, there could be differences. So for example, a Latina could probably face a greater degree of fetishization than a black woman. Because for a black woman, it's more likely that there are forms of, there are a lot more people who are being racist towards them than, for example, Latin women. So again, the thing that I'm trying to explain, I'm talking examples you can see and they might sound like very different separate examples, and they are. But the point that I'm trying to convey is that marginalized communities are not monoliths. They all face varying degrees of discrimination or positive or negative things based on different kinds of factors. But coming to the very specific example of black people, because I started off this by saying gender, is black women versus black men. There could be a point could be made that black men perhaps face more violence than black women because it's state-sanctioned violence. It's like law enforcement agencies. The incredibly high rates of incarceration that black men have to face. I don't know how well connected you guys are to US youth, but I think the top issue, he is cracking down on everyone. He's cracking down on Mexicans, he's cracking down on even Asians. Asians were always almost the immigrant group or the marginalized, not marginalized, but non-white group in America that faced the least degree of systematic oppression in this region. They were the model minority, and there's a lot of things that you can look into, what is the model minority? It was a very intentional US policy that they followed, during taking in immigrants, I think around 1950s or 60s or something. So they intentionally put in the more competent Asians into their country, and they wanted to make a model out of them. So black men, the kind of incarceration, the kind of violence that they face from law enforcement agencies, for speeding, they probably get shot. There are so many insane incidents of black people just getting shot for no reason at all in the US. And it's absolutely, if you start researching on it, There are just so many incidents. I cannot tell you one incident off the top of my head. It's just innumerous. So you might think that black men face more violence than black women at the hands of the state. But is it the case that only black men face violence? Black women could be facing another form of violence. Can anyone guess what form of violence? Domestic violence, and there is a reason for this. It's not that, so you might wonder, or you might just put two and two together and be like, oh, black men more aggressive, more likely to partake in domestic violence, which would be, another case would be made, maybe because of a combination of factors unfortunately, their education, the kind of environments that they grew up in perhaps happen to be more aggressive, and that could be factors that lead into someone being a bit more aggressive. Even taking those cases apart, so putting those cases aside, the reason that black women could be facing more violence, domestic violence, is because they are more scared of calling the police. They're more scared of calling the police on their husbands or on their boyfriends, and the reason for this is because they know that even though their significant other, their husband or boyfriend, is responsible for a crime, which is the domestic abuse, but they know for a fact that the police, given the kind of racist hatred that they have towards black men, were actually fully related to her. Or they just feature the kind of redress, the kind of punishment that they will be receiving will be so disproportionate to the crime that they have committed. And we're scared, even though this is domestic abuse and the person wants to protect themselves, there are also other kinds of concerns that the person has. So if they have children, they might be worried about, sending their father off to a place where they might very well be killed. So there are many other factors because of which black women, unfortunately, the kind of scenarios where they're able or they're comfortable in calling the police for protection is a lot lower. So because of that, it could very well be that black women face a lot more domestic abuse. But also black men probably face a lot more state-sanctioned abuse and violence, right? So once again, because of gender, their experiences are quite different. Another factor. And this factor is race and religion, okay? So, we were talking about how women, they are marginalized community, right? But even, you raised your hand. I'm sorry, I didn't address that.
I don't want to sound racist.
Yeah.
So typically, black men are more likely to leave their families.
Yeah.
So there's a larger number of single moms in the black women community. Can we build an argument based on somewhat accurate stereotypes?
So actually, this is why I'm taking this session. So, unfortunately, the reason why I am going to say a bunch of people sound offensive or not is because they go towards the right kind of ideas, but they unfortunately don't have the ability to substantiate them well. So they just end up sounding offensive, correct? And that's what we're trying to do in this session. So I'm going to mention the word right? Why this is the case, that black men are more likely to leave behind their families. So number one, and the biggest reason for this is poverty. So when you're very poor, you're just working dirt poor jobs and you're not earning much. And you don't have as many economic opportunities. So you're probably a part-time worker, or you work on the basis of contract. So we act out for example, construction sites, so the kind of economic opportunities that you have, they're just really poor. And the kind of pay that you receive, terrible. And on top of that, you have the responsibility of another individual. You have the responsibility of your children. And given the fact that your material environment or material conditions are so poor, again, because of factors that are out of your control, it's more likely that you just feel you just don't feel a sense of responsibility or urgency because your material conditions are so terrible. It makes you put yourself first. It makes you prioritize yourself, and it makes you want to go no, I just can't take this anymore. I want to go away. I want to live a life that I don't constantly have to worry about not being able to feed my kids and my wife, and I just want to live an easier life. Now, why is it that the case that their economic opportunities are so terrible. Number one, because of racism. Even if you're not talking about very dirt poor jobs or like low skilled jobs, even in the mid-tier jobs, and like this is applicable for any and all kinds of jobs. And I was explaining this to my kids, like I coach a bunch of kids, and I'm actually going to children. For example, like if you're talking about the same kind of qualifications, a black person with a bit more qualifications than the qualifications required is still less likely to be hired than a white person who has fewer qualifications than the qualifications necessary. So, because this is the case, they just end up like facing a higher degree of unemployment. Also, they end up being incarcerated a lot more. So you might be thinking, oh, maybe they have done some crime. Because of that, they get jail increases. So even though they get jail or sentencing for a so like a white man should pass should have but a black man should have. But trust me when I say this, you can find examples of cases where the person was absolutely innocent, even when the person was incarcerated. And the problem is even if you're incarcerated. So I don't know how much idea that you guys have about the criminal justice system. The thing is, it's not always the case যদি তোমাকে judge to be guilty fine for it, only then the stigma, or only then you get punished or you get jailed. No, first you just have to get arrested to be jailed. Even if you're 100% innocent, you just have to be arrested. If you're arrested, that means you're put into jail. Then the matter comes about bail money. So bail money to অনেক টাকা পয়সা লাগে. And oftentimes because of things like poverty and because of things like systematic discrimination, because black communities are more likely to be poorer or have fewer resources, they are less likely to be able to afford bail money, which means that not only are they innocently or unfairly jailed, they're also like not being able to get out of it because you have bail money to afford to practice. So their family cannot afford to practice now. So they're losing precious time in jail. They're not being able to like do work for do any work. They're not being able to look after their families. They're not being also the stigma of someone being in jail, the stigma of like not wanting to hire criminals. And when you start to concentrate for the as the person spends more and more time in jail, right? So and like that would be now criminal proceedings say tomar a lawyer. If you want to hire a good lawyer, you need money for that. And if you don't have the money to hire a lawyer, like the state hands you a lawyer, but those lawyers are essentially like usually not very great. So only social factors are counting. It's the case that there's so much poverty, and because of so much poverty, it's more likely that a black person might just end up deserting their family in comparison to someone else. I can actually find that is not necessarily born out of poverty. It's a social and cultural norm, right? So if you end up seeing enough people desert their families, and that's something that's just like something that's happening, okay? It might be considered bad, but it's something that's just happening a lot more around you. So if you're seeing this happen a lot more around you, it might be the case that you're just a bit more comfortable doing that, right? So because of these kinds of external factors, it could be the case that black men are more likely to desert their families. Does that now make sense? So do I sound offensive? That is what I'm trying to achieve. Not that you can be racist without sounding offensive. It's that you should be able to explain a lot of social phenomena that are true around you without sounding like you're racist or without actually being racist. Because a lot of social phenomena, they're actually true. Like debates or arguments about this stuff and they sound offensive, because there have truths to them. But it's just that people don't know how to substantiate, which is the reason why I'm doing this session. Where was I? So I'm going to do so. I keep forgetting. Basic religion. Basic religion, right. Okay. Before that, I might be. Okay. Give me like 2 minutes. I'll just start this session. Okay. Till now, it's like what I'm saying here.
Yep.
What I'm saying here, like, is the idea getting conveyed that the experiences vastly differ on the basis of different kinds of factors. That's a very simple idea that I'm trying to convey. I'm just using a lot of examples.
You mean intersectionality?
Yes, exactly. I just didn't want to use that jargony word. Because intersectionality, some of you might understand, some of you might not be able to connect as immediately. So intersectionality is like what I'm trying to explain. Yeah. So, like, do you want to explain what intersectionality is?
No. You should.
Basically what I'm Maybe go there. So, race and religion. So, let's go back to women. So, back in like 1960s and 1970s, I'm talking about the US, where the feminist movement was, I'm pretty sure the feminist movement began before that, but it was like it was spreading a lot more, political organization was happening a lot more on the basis of like true feminist or like feminist movement. And the thing is, even then, Kumar, it's not that just because there was a feminist movement and just because what the people we're talking about are women, doesn't mean that everyone will have the same kind of expectations or demands from the feminist movement. So a very simple example for this is that during the 1960s, when there was like a lot more women getting employed, a lot more women working, and like a very overall agenda of the feminist movement happened to be that they wanted to get opportunities outside of their home, they wanted to get paid opportunities outside of their home. And like they wanted to get employed, there was still a dichotomy in between, for example, what black women wanted and what white women wanted. So white women wanted the usual kind of employment. They wanted things like jobs, they wanted things like payment, a higher, like they wanted higher wages. But black women actually wanted different kinds of employment. So again, because of systemic reasons, black women happen to make up a lot of the people who work in things like childcare, who work in things like house maids. So have you guys seen The Help? Like the movie The Help? So yeah, so kind of do you see like the black community women? They're the ones who majorly make up like house maids, right? So working inside homes. So they wanted to get paid properly for housework. So they wanted to get paid properly for childcare. They wanted to get paid properly for being doulas. So do you guys know what a doula is? A doula is like someone who delivers babies, but inside homes and using like more natural procedures. So like if you don't want to go to a hospital to deliver your baby, you can have a doula at your house. And midwife. Oh yes, sorry, midwife. It's the more commonly known term. I was actually when I was writing down this, there's another term for it. Black women, yes, midwifery. So midwifery and black women have a very strong correlation. That was the case. So even though the feminist movement, the mainstream feminist movement, they were trying to get opportunities outside of the homes, black women were more concerned about like getting properly paid for housework. Because like housework usually is not seen as formal as someone working in the office. So there wasn't a lot more, there wasn't as much discussion as you are political organizing for this. So again, on the basis of things like race and religion, even women who happen to be a monolithic marginalized community, even though their priorities differ. I'm just using a lot of examples. I hope that's okay. So even then, actually example in schools. So generally, women might see law enforcement and think of them as means of safety. So whenever we see police, whenever we see like just the law enforcement agencies, there could be some partners that go like that's a bit breached. Because like usually anarchy associates with you just associate the law enforcement agency and people who work for them like people who protect, right? So usually if you're returning home from a job like at like age or 9 p.m. For example, even though I can go anywhere during the daytime. If I want to go to freaking Chittagong and like that, and the thing is, whenever it's like post 8 or 9 p.m., I need to So like, if I happen to see someone like this, my phone. Unfortunately, I happen to read the news a lot. Like, I happen to read the news a lot. So maybe I personally do not feel immediately safer when seeing the police, but it's not very surprising if women end up feeling safer because of seeing the law enforcement, someone from law enforcement, right? But the case is often the opposite for other marginalized communities, even within women. Suppose women from Chittagong Hill Tracts. So armed, and they happen to commit a lot of gender-based violence in Chittagong Hill Tracts. But also, even if they're not the ones who are directly committing those crimes, they often happen to be the ones who protect the people who commit those crimes. So if there are cases like these, the police and the army, they will be the ones who try to stop the protests against like these criminals. So they immediately associate law enforcement communities with danger, with threat. So even then, there's a difference. So like even in the US, I think there's a movement called the Blue Lives Matter. So there's a movement called Black Lives Matter, right? Everyone's familiar with that, right? So Blue Lives Matter, so Black Lives Matter on against police. Because there's so much police violence in the black community. But Blue Lives Matter should do what because they're uniform blue, police it. So Blue Lives Matter. It was like a counter movement to the Black Lives Matter movement. Yes. So, yeah, can you do me a favor?
Yes, we want to
Oh.
সব খাবার তো মাইনরিটি রাইট
Yeah. So, Blue Lives Matter here, conservatives were talking when they want to take the stance against it. A very common tactic that they use is, oh, the people who support like Black Lives Matter, the people who want to defund the police, they are supporting violence against women because the police protect women. And if you want to defund the police, if you want to get rid of the police, if you want to like reduce the kind of arms and weapons that the police carry, you're essentially what you're doing is you're like reducing protections for women. So they try to use women women's panic against this kind of thing. So once again, like experiences and opinions and ideologies, they very vastly differ on the basis of these factors. Now, fourth factor, which is context based on region and co-opted victims. I hear this sounds about jargon, okay? But the thing is, the very simple idea that I'm trying to convey is that a person who is marginalized somewhere may not be marginalized elsewhere. So, a very fresh example is people who are conservative and people who belong from the majoritarian religion in Bangladesh. Zoran Bangladeshi rejoice for is a universal thing. Everyone's rejoicing for many different kinds of reasons. Because he's anti-Zionism, he's like pro-socialism, he's pro-LGBTQ community. So there's like a lot of reasons why people want to rejoice for him. That's understandable. But you can also very clearly understand that people who are rejoicing Zoran Bangladeshi for like very funny reasons. So, for example, Jamaat Shibir aligning people. Right? Like they're really happy about the fact that a Muslim mayor is like a Muslim is the mayor of New York. And this is actually a very big deal. Given the kind of Islamophobia that unfolded after 9/11, and 9/11 happened in New York, right? So it was the epicenter of like all the massive kinds of Islamophobia that started unfolding in the US. The kind of policies that started, also state surveillance turning very slow after 9/11. So a lot of reasons. Why? Like Zoran Bangladeshi being the first Muslim mayor in New York is so important. But at the same time, when people who are aligning with the more fundamentalist politics in Bangladesh, who are not necessarily, or I don't know why I'm using the term not necessarily, who are definitely not oppressed on the basis of their religion, like them rejoicing this news may raise a few questions or eyebrows. Like, hey, why are you rejoicing? Because the people who are the diaspora, the people who are living in New York, the Muslims or the brown people, not just Muslims, brown people, like there was racism, like again, there were no against it, there was so much Islamophobia, there was so much general racism, right, against brown people. So they're rejoicing living in New York because they have lived through these experiences of racism and Islamophobia. It makes so much sense for them to rejoice this much, right? But then at the same time, when the people who you know support other kinds of fundamentalist politics are rejoicing for them, you're just like, what? So I take a simple example, I mean, they can.
Adopting something that is like adopting something that isn't exactly part of your.
Yes, adopting something that isn't necessarily something that you should adopt. Like it's someone else's something, you should probably not adopt it. Again, I'm trying to make the language as non-jargon as possible. So okay, let's just wait for the gentleman to work. Okay, this is gonna distract the hell out of me. Hey, what is your question? My staff here. Do you want to put your head down and think that? It's okay if you want to put your head down. I don't know. I'm glad like this is the thing that you did best for sure, Michelle. Do you know this stuff? The reason why this is important is because unfortunately in politics this is misused a lot. So for example, Hindu nationalists in India, they like co-opting the suffering of Hindus in Bangladesh, and also they make a lot of misinformation, which also makes it a lot harder for people to hear about the actual incidents. And the same goes for fundamentalists in Bangladesh. They will often use the oppression that Muslims face in India and will try to create a lot of panic in Bangladesh. So this is called co-opting with victimhood. You are not necessarily a victim. Because of your context, because of your region, because of the kind of environment that you live in. Someone else with the same identity, not the same identity, but a few factors like race and religion, might face oppression because of those factors in a different context. But what you end up doing is, you end up co-opting their victimhood. They are being victimized by something. You are not necessarily being victimized by that, but you take it and you use it to empower or embolden your own politics. So this is also a form of this is also how even marginalized communities in one place are not necessarily marginalized communities in other contexts, right? So it differs based on countries, based on regions, based on societies. Okay, let's move on to why it's so important to not think of marginalized communities as monoliths. So remember, those are monoliths, they're one singular block, they're one whole thing. And unfortunately, very few good marginalized communities there. But the reason why it's so problematic to view marginalized communities in this way, and what happens as a result of doing this, is that debate arguments are okay. We kind of assume that whenever there's going to be a movement, whenever there's going to be some sort of protest or some sort of demand for change, we kind of assume solidarity on behalf of the marginalized community. So, suppose there's a social movement for LGBT people or for women. And we kind of assume, oh, just because this is a social movement for women or for immigrants or for the marginalized people or for the LGBT community, everyone from that community will come behind or will join the group of that. Should I say something? I'm sorry, I hate this so much. Okay. Okay, it's not that. The reason why it's so problematic to see marginalized communities as monoliths is because this is the question. Thank you. Great. Okay, once again, the reason why it is so problematic to see marginalized communities as monoliths is because our geopolitical argument as to why a social movement would work or a bid for change would work is because it's for that marginalized community. Obviously, everyone from that marginalized community will join, will approve of it, will support it, will come behind it. So that's not necessarily true. Because why? Because of intersectionality, because of everything that we have heard of. Because people's experiences are vastly different, even within the same community. It's vastly different on the basis of many other kinds of factors. She's going to discuss religion, gender, economic privilege, whatnot. Okay? Now, I'm going to give an example. Again, like I said, this workshop will have a lot of examples. Suppose Kumar Vijay, Kamala Harris, right? She was in the presidential election in 2024. She was a brown woman. She was a Democratic candidate. Like, people who are out of touch probably thought, oh, obviously she's going to win. She has all of the cards. She's a woman, she's a brown woman, she's a Democratic candidate, and she's against Donald Trump. Everyone hates Donald Trump, right? But guess what? She only got like 54% of the votes from women. You probably kind of maybe I don't need to be a statistic finale which like can you guess what kind of percentage that Kamala Harris received votes? I thought you raised your hand. So probably number down, I think the she just took the maybe at least 60% of vote right, 70% of vote. But it's 54, but it's very half. So, like, why, right? But then, for example, Joe Biden, 2020 election, he received 57% of votes from women. So, a white man, a very senile white man, who can barely speak, got more votes than Kamala. Again, I'm not going to talk about Kamala Harris's politics, like whether or not that's better than Joe Biden. I'm just saying, identity politics, just because Kamala Harris is a brown woman, and Democratic candidate doesn't necessarily mean that every woman will be rushing to the polls to vote for her. But even Hillary Clinton, I think, received the same number of votes as Kamala Harris. So a white, very privileged woman received the same percentage of votes from women. And also, I'm talking about 2016 Kumar election and Kamala Harris election, 2024 election. And given the kind of immigration that the US undergoes or receives, like you could make the argument that by the time it was 2024, in comparison to 2016, because that's like 8 years, there are perhaps more brown women voters, brown female voters in the US, right? But it's the same percentage. So, like, okay. Acha, for it. You're here till 6. Did you actually? Oh, it's right. Okay, so the point that I'm trying to make is just because someone is, for example, a brown woman or a woman doesn't mean they will automatically get the majority of the votes from women, even though we did. But initially it sounds very. This makes sense, right? Like, okay, why would women not vote for Kamala Harris? Why would women not vote for him?
So in these cases, since both of them got like pretty similar also like 54 and 57, wouldn't race be a bigger factor if
again, the numbers will be slightly different. But I mean, you will see they receive the same percentage of votes. So, তুমি কি Joe Biden সাথে compare করতেছো? It could be. It could very well be that he's a white man, Kamala Harris is a brown woman. Like nobody likes brown women. But yeah, and that's the point that I'm trying to make. It's just that you really won't know for sure. Just because someone is a brown woman, just because someone is a woman, doesn't mean they will automatically get a majority of the votes, right? The point that, and the logic that I'm trying to derive from this is that even for other kinds of social movements, just because there's a social movement for the LGBT community, just because there's a social movement for the trans community, just because there's a social movement for immigrants, doesn't mean they will all support it. By the way, there is a significant chunk of Latin voters for Trump who voted for Trump because they believed when Trump said, oh, I'm going to get rid of the bad hombres, the good hombres can stay. And they're like, oh, I don't know for him. The bad hombres will go, that will probably be my cousin. Like, I hate him, he's annoying. But, like, see, people don't vote just on the basis of like things like identity, like gender. But they vote from a combination of reasons and factors. just because they are an immigrant, just because they're Latino, Latino female, but just because they're from the Latin community, just because they're immigrants from the Latin community, doesn't necessarily mean that they will not vote for Trump. Just because they're women doesn't necessarily mean that they will vote for him. Oh my God, thank you very much. Guys, I swear, I feel very oppressed. Achha, we just have to keep moving on. Okay. Nice example. That could very well be helpful to you in debates. Are you guys familiar with the Stonewall riots? Stonewall riots. Stonewall riots? What was it? Just a vague idea.
As far as I remember, they were
Pretty sure.
the Berlin ones, right?
Huh?
The Berlin ones. Berlin.
No, New York.
Oh, New York. Okay.
Yeah.
So they were.
Basically, what happened was that it started with a lot of bars being owned by cartels, and that was one of the excuses the police used to basically like violently close down and arrest people for cross-dressing, primarily cross-dressing. And one day it got so bad that the people in the bar, the specific part that was talking about the day it happened, people started basically resisting the police and it became like a mass movement, and from that day actually a mass movement started throughout New York.
Yes.
Which
They turned into an LGBTQ.
yes.
Yes.
And a lot of them were also like they were bringing up concerns about the fact a lot of them get marginalized because they're queer and homeless, because they were homeless because of being queer. And the mass
See, intersectionality. Is that it? Yes. So basically, it was a very monumental, very significant landmark protest or movement for the you might be wondering, well, it's okay. Okay, you might think that, oh, it's a protest for the LGBT community. Why would anyone from the LGBT community resist this, right? But guess what? There actually was a lot of fracture within the community. What happened? Speaker that you introduced speaker. Okay, people from the LGBT. So, actually, example of cheap. So there was something called the, I don't know how to pronounce this. I might be getting this wrong. It's the Mattachine Society. Mattachine. Mattachine Society. And it also was an activist group for the LGBT community. But they heavily resisted the group of protesters or rioters who were carrying out the Stonewall riots while protesting for the LGBT community. So they went to a point where they posted like a banner or something, like a poster, and they were like something along the lines of we appeal or we request our brothers and sisters to cooperate with the police, and we will cooperate with the police, and please resort to peaceful means. So basically, they more or less believed in working within the system, and they really heavily opposed these forms of radical actions, because they believed that whatever kind of change that they had worked so hard to attain will be reversed because of this kind of radical action. So they distanced themselves from the Stonewall rioters, and finally, then they also fractured. Oda fractured, they turned into two different groups. So Mattachine Society के fractured हुए, I think, Gay Liberation Fund একটা হয়েছিল. The point that I'm trying to make is that just because there is a social movement for one community doesn't mean that everyone from that community will agree or will get behind it. Sometimes it might cause fracturing, sometimes it might cause even more separation. So that's the only thing that that's the only thing I think you should get away from this part of the session because at a very key mistake that people make while debating and while making arguments for why a social movement will be successful is they often forget to take into consideration the very real possibility that some of the people from within the community will not agree. Obviously, well, their opponents will very nicely point it out and will probably make an entire case on this. So if there is a motion for some form of radical action or radical change towards towards a social movement, the very stock or the very normal or usual case that we get from the side opposition is that this is going to create a lot more fracturing and division between the young. The thing is, I don't regard side propositions or the team that are supporting this, the team that wants this radical action to take place, they forget to take into consideration. They forget to include this in their case and to show why it's not going to be as bad. They need to show some substantiation, something, some analysis to prove why. Sure, there could be some form of fracturing, but that's still not going to be devastating for the social movement. Okay. The second, I think, they kind of to change the management. Later, I actually wanted to place. They're susceptible to propaganda. Do you know what susceptible means? Susceptible?
Vulnerable.
They're more prone. But they're more likely to believe propaganda. Again, there's some truth to it, but unfortunately, it's just that nuance higher. Okay. So, at a pretty simple analysis of Aonkita, the poor people, they more or less are always the ones who are believing populism. Right-wing populism, or in general populist ideas. Is that what populism means? Populism. Simple question, you don't have to use unique terminologies.
The idea that people should be put first.
But first, yes, kind of. But any other idea of populism, right-wing populism, we hear this term a lot ever since Trump.
It's similar to nationalism
Yeah, similar to nationalism. It's very anti-state. It's very anti-establishment. But it's very anti-convention. So whatever has been happening till now, that's all horrible. That's all been very alienating. Basically, the kind of appeal that they try to have is constant with you've been left behind by the state, you've been left behind by the establishment. We are the ones who are going to help you. We don't that much. They're also very anti-technocratic. So they don't like things like formal policy making. They don't like things like different kinds of ministries and committees. They see them as intellectuals that are not necessarily meeting the kinds of interests that regular people have. So they can elitist monitor it. So each of these people all together comes together and forms populism. So at a fully commonplace idea is that poor people are very prone to populist ideas. And they obviously use Trump's example, American. And Trump actually didn't say this, by the way. He said that I love the uneducated. The thing is, I'm not sure that they're only voting for Trump just because they're poor. Are they? Why? Why else would they vote for Trump?
Trump said that he loves the uneducated, they're most likely uneducated.
But এটা বাদ ধরো ট্রাম্পের নাম বলে and Trumpe's kind of politics. Why do poor people or why do people who don't think politics? Why do they end up voting for Trump a lot?
In that specific election, হলো যে ট্রাম্পের আগে যে বাইডেনের অ্যাডমিনিস্ট্রেশন ছিল কোভিড এরা অনেক সাফার করছে ইকোনমিক্যালি, রাইট? সো পিপল ওয়ার গ্র্যাভিটেটিং মোর টুয়ার্ডস যে binary vice president was Kamala Harris. So what if the same thing repeats? So to avoid that, we are going to. I don't really remember.
So 2016 you went to Trump and said, "You have to leave." It's like you have to leave, but
I'm just so interested in the talk.
So.
Was it because Trump promised more employment or something?
Yeah, you guys are saying the terms. So, yeah, employment, economic, yeah,
very manipulative.
Huh? Money. Yeah, exactly. It's like financial freedom. Yeah, they just want, bro, they just want material, like, they don't want to be broke. They just don't want to be broke.
People don't care about being cried against if they're
Exactly.
rich,
And the
right?
problem is, they give purely misinformation and truth. That the only reason why you don't have a job, the only reason why you're not getting a salary, the only reason why like your economy sucks so badly is because the government is spending so much money on things like immigrants and people of color and basically people who are not human. So it's a blend of racism, it's a blend of economic opportunities. So it's not just that just because they're poor, they're somehow more prone to becoming homeless. It's a much deeper issue. They happen to be like uneducated, and because they are uneducated, they are probably less able to rationalize things. So when someone says, oh, just because immigrants are coming into this country, you are not getting jobs. You need someone who should be able to ask the question, okay, why is that the case? How is like, for example, like the Indian, TikTok trend does it. So brown people, especially like Asians and Indians, who happen to get higher degrees and who happen to be in more advanced fields. But if we're also joke about it, they're like, how important trend, TikTok and Instagram. They're like, oh, immigrants are taking away your jobs. Sure, come and take my jobs. It's like then they hold up like 3 to 4 degrees because they happen to be in advanced fields. So you need people to be able to ask questions like, wait, really, when immigrants are currently our job now, how is it the case? Actually, social welfare accommodation spending by government accommodation spend for social welfare to put it, I don't have a job. So these are the questions that you need people to be able to ask. And because they happen to be more because they happen to have more primary level of education, because they probably did not get the opportunity to get a secondary level of education, they did not get the opportunity to attend universities and get a college degree, they did not have the same degree of rationality or rationality sounds pretty well. They did not have this, the degree of rationality to be able to question these kinds of propaganda. But even besides all of this, do you think it should be people's responsibility to discern what is propaganda and what isn't? Or is there something else that should be protecting people from misinformation? A bit of both, right? A bit of both, right? A bit of both. But unfortunately nowadays it's entirely on people to be able to discern and distinguish between what is misinformation and what is not. Because in reality, what ideally should have happened was that there should have been institutions, there should have been functioning governments that did not get lobbied by things like Facebook and Instagram and big tech, and did not allow big tech, which essentially thrives on misinformation. It's actually a profit model for them. But the more misinformation there is on their platforms, the more people stay angry, the more people stay insecure, the more people are fearful, and the more they spend time on those social media platforms, therefore making those social media platforms more money. So it's actually a profit model for them. And because they're so powerful, they lobby governments to the degree that the governments cannot hold them accountable to the degree that is actually important, which means that is it really only the citizens or people's responsibility to be able to decide, it is information, that's not the case, right? So please do not ever make an argument like, oh, poor people, they are more prone to becoming populist, they are more prone to populism and believing stuff. আচ্ছা, আরেকটা হচ্ছে খুবই কমন এক্সাম্পল হচ্ছে তোমার রেবেল গ্রুপস or any kind of resistance groups. সেটা কোনো কান্ট্রিতে যখন থাকে, কিছু মানুষ সবসময় মনে করে ওই রেবেল গ্রুপস, রেজিস্ট্যান্স গ্রুপস সবসময় ফান্ডেড বাই সাম আদার কান্ট্রি। সো জাস্ট ফর এক্সাম্পল, বাংলাদেশ নিজের চিটাগং হিন্দু ট্রাফিক যখনই কিছু হয়, রেবেল মিয়ানমার করছে, যখনই হিন্দুদের সাথে কিছু হয় ইন্ডিয়া করছে, পাকিস্তানে যখন বালুচিস্তান প্রোটেস্ট করে, যখন বালুচিস্তান সেপারেট স্টেট চায় বা আরো বেশি প্রোটেকশনস চায়, তখন পাকিস্তান গভর্নমেন্ট বলে, ও এটা ইন্ডিয়া করতেছে। ইন্ডিয়াতে যখন কাশ্মীরে বা নর্থ ইস্ট ইন্ডিয়াতে যখন হয়, স্পেশালি নর্থ ইস্ট ইন্ডিয়াতে যখনই কোনো ধরনের প্রোটেস্ট হয়, তখন ইন্ডিয়ান গভর্নমেন্ট বলে, ও এটা চায়না করতেছে। তারপর হচ্ছে তোমার হংকংয়ে যখন তোমার প্রোটেস্ট হয়ে আসতেছে, এখন থামে নাই, প্রোটেস্ট হয়ে আসতেছে, very common excuse that the Chinese government makes is that this is US funded, this is US sponsored, the US is behind all of this. So, I'm going to just, তোমরা তো মানুষ, তাই না? তোমরা কি বলো? or discrimination. কোনো একটা external মানে factor বা entity যদি এসে তোমাকে delude করার চেষ্টা করে, যদি তোমাকে mislead করার চেষ্টা করে and makes you want to take up arms against the state or makes you want to like start protesting against the state, are you that guy? Like if you did not face any form of oppression or discrimination from the state, would an external entity be able to just enter and make you go, huh?
আচ্ছা প্রেশারটা তো অন্য কোনো ইস্যুতে হতে পারে, যেমন মনে করেন আমাকে অনেক কান্ট্রি মানে একটা কান্ট্রি অনেক সেভারাল লোনে ফেলে দিচ্ছে, তো আমি তো ওই মানে কান্ট্রির গভর্নমেন্টের এগেইনস্টে যেতে পারবো না, তাই না?
Okay, what you're talking about is a bit different.
মানে এটা তো প্রেশার ক্রিয়েট করছে আমার।
হ্যাঁ, sure, it's a pressure create করছে। What I'm trying to talk about is countryর ভিতরে খুবই স্পেসিফিক জায়গায় ধরো কোনো ধরনের রেজিস্ট্যান্স হচ্ছে, কোনো ধরনের প্রোটেস্ট হচ্ছে, the people who are a bit different from the rest of the country, religion wise, ethnicity wise, তখন সবসময় governments গুলো একটা খুবই easy excuse use করে, এটা হচ্ছে they are being funded by our rival country, they are being sponsored or they are being মানে basically এগুলোকে planning করতে so much a country এগুলো মানুষগুলোকে করাচ্ছে। And তোমরা তো মানুষ, right? তোমরা একটু নিজের চিন্তা করো, তোমরা কি এগুলো মানে this is just sounds so ridiculous, right? So that's what I'm trying to explain. If the state did not allow room for like resentment being built towards the state, if the state did not allow for discrimination to take place, যেটার কারণে মানুষের মধ্যে স্টেটের against sentiments develop না করতো, তাহলে আমি বুঝি মানে আমি অ্যাথলিস্ট, I am not an all the way entity. There could be influences from external factors, and there has been cases where external entities হচ্ছে তোমার একটু stoke up করে দিছে। In fact, CIA এটাই তো like 1960s and 70s এর time, and in Caribbean countries, they're responsible for a range of political instabilities and regime changes, because they needed their business interests to get a stake. So Caribbean যখন তোমার একটা socialism spread করতেছিল world-এ, communism like cold war time-এ, CIA হচ্ছে তোমার regime change-এর শুরুতে যত ধরনের socialist communist government form ছিল ওগুলোকে সরাইছে। I know the point that I'm trying to make is not that কোনো মানে সিনারিওতে এটা হয় না যে একটা external factor এসে regime change করে দিছে or একটা protest start করে দিছে। But the reasons have to be a bit more sophisticated than just একটা group of people. Identity আসছে, আমাদেরকে বলছে আমরা protest করতেছি। That's not the case, right? That's the point I'm trying to make. I'm not trying to tell you guys to না এটা কখনোই হতে পারে না যে external factor, একটা external entity এসে influence করতে পারে না দেশের politics. Now, what could be the actual reasons behind that word external entity এসে influence করতেছে? Number one reason could be unhuman trauma. So this so before that I'm going to explain when is this actually the case? So external entities are when are people very susceptible to propaganda? Susceptible, again, I hope everyone understands the term susceptible. I don't want to use the jargony terms, but basically, when are people so easily influenced by propaganda? There are many scenarios where they are influenced. So places like terrorist organizations, the families of terrorist organizations, rebel groups follow, cults follow, children in like very strictly ideological communities or schools follow. So these are groups of people who are very easily influenced and captured by propaganda. But what is the reason? What's the range of reasons as to why this actually happens? Number one is just unhealed trauma. So rebel groups, the reason why they often take up arms, and even it's actually pretty easy to misuse from places that have really high political instability. Like for example, Kashmir could be one example. Why is it so easy for from our certain kinds of groups or influences to take to capture people's trauma there? Because the state has been responsible for causing people so much trauma. And this is something that has remained unhealed and unaddressed. And this is something that keeps happening. The state keeps violating people, the state keeps killing people. So whenever there is some scenario that external entities come and try to create even more instability through people of Kashmir, The reason isn't they're so unnuanced. It's that people have unhealed trauma. They have deep resentment against the state. Their families, their brother was killed, their sister was killed, their fathers and mothers were killed, right? Their family members died. So it's a lot more easy for an external entity to come and influence those people into doing something that they otherwise wouldn't have done. Second, with the community, they have no other source of education or knowledge. So this is the case for like really closed off communities. So Mormon communities, you guys have heard of the Mormon groups, Mormons are Mormon Amish community. Amish, yes, that's what I was looking for. Yeah, so I think Mormons do not use electricity. Amish should not use electricity. Mormons are just only closed off. So, unfortunately, actually, we actually recently put recently, but even like a few years ago, this is what I knew, absolutely necessary now. Like, absolutely necessary now today, they will not use things like Western medicine, they will not use things like electricity. Actually, I'm pretty sure. Maybe they have like lights on or something. But other than that, no electronic device on is for blood donation. They don't have blood transfusions. So even when they're in life-threatening situations and they need blood from other people, they don't take in blood. So they completely stay detached from like the different usual lifestyles that the people out in the outside world have. So the reason why the children of those communities are so vulnerable is because they live in such closed-off communities that they don't have other forms of education, information or educational sources. So the internet used to provide usual schools other schools are open to religious scripture so they have no alternative source of information or knowledge. That is when they're susceptible to propaganda. The third scenario could be that they're really young, which is also worse in tandem with the second one. They're really young, which means that they haven't developed their cognitive abilities as much, which means that they are not able to discern what's right and wrong, what's rational or what's irrational, right? So often they're more susceptible to propaganda. So my request would be, if you're ever trying to make an argument about why a particular community or a particular group is so susceptible to propaganda or is so susceptible to getting influenced by external factors, just don't say it like that, but try to be a bit more realistic about the situation. The third stereotype is they're powerless. Actually, powerless জিনিসটা আমি একটু ডিসপ্লেস করছি আমি পরের স্লাইডে এই জিনিসটা বুঝাবো ঠিক আছে so why is this so important? Why do we do that? Okay, I thought I was waiting. I think we can finish it within 5 minutes. So, why is not seeing these groups as a monolith so important and helpful in BP debating? So, apart from you, over showing you BP debating on it too. Yeah, like what do you mean? Upper house, lower house. So there is not only two sides, side government and side opposition. Side government and side opposition and upper house and lower house. So it makes your job a lot more difficult because not only do you have to defend and oppose a side or whatever, you also have to make sure that if you're in the lower houses, you also have to make sure that you have something new to add to the debate, which means that your job is a lot more difficult. Which is when intersectionality becomes so helpful in debates. But it is almost like a hack in BP debate. So, in case speaking. So how can we help? So it actually a motion, we're starting motion for case speaking. I know it sounds pretty funny, but there was actually a very serious debate about this. This was an article. That was a GBC. Just take a photo. Oh, sure, sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay, done? Okay, so government কি করছে So after closing government second December 1st we see, but I think that ওরা first হতে পারত ওরা first I don't clearly remember the debate but ওরা first হতে পারত So আমরা তো obviously from opening government আমরা খুবই মানে যেটা একদম দরকার যেটা একদম necessary which is like why these chatbots won't be as terrible why women need it the reason is here why in the current contemporary society why is it necessary for women to have this blah blah ঠিক আছে অনেক কথা বলছে আমাদের ক্লোজিং গভর্নমেন্ট এসে কি বলছে আমাদের ক্লোজিং গভর্নমেন্ট এসে বলছে this debate is most important in conservative society conservative societies where women are not necessarily allowed to do things like dating they are not even sometimes allowed to talk to other men they are not put in co-educational schools they get to interact with the other like they get to interact with men as just as friends or just as classmates so what happens is that they never get the experience of dating after a very long time some of them might get some experience into dating but other families each families allow with the card but then they are just married off they're married off and that's how they have to live for the rest of their lives what we do for them, and closing government, our team to what we do for them is we give them a source of like exploration. They get to explore these things. Real world, they get to get a sense and an experience of relationships, how relationships might look like before they go into marriages, before they enter marriages, and it's just that for them, right? So, equally on and this could end up winning them the debate. They ended up being second, but it could have potentially debate winning case too. So, it is how just by thinking of at a marginalized community, women can be considered a marginalized community, but within women, there are women who are living in the first world country, there are women who are living in the third world country, so other experience is vastly different. So when you think of another layer, which women to women but even within women, if we think of another layer, so easily new material to that. So this is why I was saying thinking of intersectionality is almost like a hack in the debate. So I just want to clarify something. You guys might after looking to analysis DC for CG. Why that would be considered? There's something else that they added. I'm not sure if they added it or not. I would have added it if I were CG. But age should be both a conservative women and their journalism is very necessary. I would also why that does not make any sense. Because they don't watch the world. Who is the creator?
Women that are actively seeking companionship with other people.
And failing to do so. Not necessarily. I mean, who is the creator?
Oh, like men not being emotionally available.
No.
I'm talking about
Heterosexual women.
heterosexual women
Who have access to that thing in the
exactly. Access to what?
Or like companionship with they have access to companionship with men.
Exactly. So, debate could clear which it's about the women who have a choice. Like, do I want to go for dating a man or do I just, try it out with a channel? So it's obviously not about the group of women who are their families actually allow for an to see men, to befriend men. But why is it still there? If CG's case makes sense. When I did a piece of analysis of it. क्योंकि वो करना yes, so rising trend economy usually for anything.
It doesn't matter who you are. Educate your definitely.
Yeah. When something is a rising trend, means that peer pressure. It could have peer pressure. Maybe not in this case because this is already clear. And the way that people are going to manage to clearly take the society. So maybe peer pressure, but it could be peer pressure. Peer pressure can be something that you can include in debates with rising trends. But rising trends there could be specifically you need to keep in mind is that whenever something is a rising trend, it means a lot more people use it. It means a lot more people find it a bit more normalized, and a lot more people have access to this. So even though this debate is very specifically about the women who have a choice, when this becomes a rising trend and when a lot more women keep using it, it then expands or it then reaches the other women who otherwise wouldn't have a choice. The people about whom this debate wasn't originally about, but because this is a rising trend, it then becomes, it includes those women as well. I think it's just a very two-sided to put it up you guys in the future. Okay. Impact. Acha, this is a very big emotion. But sorry, this is emotion. I'm sure it wrote it. So basically, right now, the convention is that if you do these things, like paying tax, donating to the poor, it would be thought of that if you do these things, you will be blessed or you will be rewarded by God. Instead of saying that, perhaps what could be said is that people just get blessed or people get benefited or people get rewarded on a random basis. And I can randomly come. It's not going to be transactional, it's not going to be the fact that if you do this things, you will get like these rewards. It's going to be that, okay, this person randomly got blessed with this, that person randomly got blessed with that, okay? Simple. Okay. I think this is an example useful, but it's not necessary just for impact. Maybe that's not my case in Mokuchiko, but I think that's the foundations we did. Okay, so we did not see the motion that the motion was given. Job prep time Shishu, we see the common with this motion, and we were opening government. So I was like, oh my god, this is but what we did was that we made the debate about a very specific group of people. Who could we this debate about? How? Economically vulnerable. Yeah, exactly. But there are any other ways to which this debate could be made very specific. It could be specific to people who practice Muslim. But the thing is, the debate is already done. So if you're not a practicing Muslim, you probably don't care about how you are going to get rewarded, right? So automatically, maybe the debate is about practicing Muslims or practicing the people who practice religion. So even within people who practice religion daily, we picked economically vulnerable people. And I'm not going to reason that I say as to why this is so problematic for them. So number one, they just don't have the resources. They themselves are poor. Who will they donate? They cannot donate to people, right? Number two, they don't have the time. So if you think of a laborer who works for 17 hours a day and बाकी टाइम में बाशा जाते ताकि कुछ ओरा खाए ओरा घूमाए. So if you think about those people who need and who get paid like $2, maybe not even $2, maybe actually per hour, and they have to work 17 or 18 hours maybe, because ওদের জন্য এত ঘন্টা না কাজ করতে doesn't make sense because ওরা per hour এতই কম কাজ করে. So it's just not feasible for them to even make time, right? And some of them, I'm pretty sure many still do. That's how disciplined and committed they are. I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm saying that for any sort of religious participation, not just Islam, like if you want to make time for religion, if you want to make time for like praying and devoting yourself, you probably need that time, right? Which a lot of really economically vulnerable people, poor people, who have to work almost every hour that they can to feed themselves and feed their families, probably cannot. Also, they probably don't have that headspace. So, someone, again, who works for 18, 19 hours in the sun, who probably gets screamed at, who probably has faced even an injury at the construction site at Kashmir person, probably an injury person, probably has back pain, but that would people would kill apart because they just don't earn that much to feed themselves or nourish their bodies as much. So these people probably don't have that kind of headspace to kind of participate in these activities. So what they might feel like is that because they're not being able to do these activities, they might feel because they're not being able to take part in these activities, they are not being blessed by God or they're not being rewarded by God. Yeah.
I don't think everyone mentioned you have to practice all these things to get the work in Madhya work. So Allah didn't promise this.
That is exactly what the notion is suggesting.
Yeah, you heard things that some people thought it is not something proved or it's not something Allah said in Quran.
Yeah, that is exactly what the motion is saying. That the motion is how it's okay. What we need to tell to people is that it's okay if you cannot do these activities, you will still probably be blessed by God. But that is the kind of
it's not something promised, then why?
Like, it's not necessarily about what is written in scripture itself. Like the Quran and the Hadith might say something. It's more about how the preachers themselves are promoting that narrative. The debate is about
yes, that. I'm talking about that too. Not everyone is promoting this. There are some highly educated scholars who are promoting the right thing. Then why are you not following through? Then why are you following?
It's not about wrong or right.
Okay. Here's the thing. In debates, it is not about necessarily what people, like majority of people in the real world are doing. It's about two options or two choices. So it's about, suppose you're doing A or you're doing B. So some clerics, some leaders, they might portray or they might interpret religion in one way, and other clerics and other leaders interpret or talk about religion in another way. So the motion, and you don't get to choose which side you're on in a debate. I mean, you never get to choose. So even if you personally don't believe in something, or you might have some knowledge that makes it harder for you to defend your own side, because a motion in Harvard or in any motion, I don't get to choose which side I want to talk about. So the debate is about how you just assume that that's the situation. That is the situation. Exactly. So, like, you're aware of certain clerics or certain leaders portray, but the debate kind of equalizes that. So it's like two things are happening on equal grounds. You have to defend this, and the other team has to defend that. Is that clear? Yeah. Okay, great. So, okay. আরেকটা example দিই। আরেকটা example হচ্ছে, এই tournament একটা motion ছিল, যে this house regrets the rise. First round motion.
Anti-hero.
Yes, this house regrets the rise of anti-hero women. So, anti-hero women, for example, have you guys seen Gone Girl, the movie Gone Girl? Gone Girl? Gone Girl, that basically Gone Girl equal, but the main character is a bit pissed off. So, they commit crimes, right? But the movie turns throughout অনেক psychological portrayal দেখায় যে why this person commits these crimes. And it's not that the movie justifies these crimes, it's just that they try to show why a person might be compelled or a person might be forced to commit these crimes. So এরকম টাইপের মানে questionable characters নিয়ে অনেক movies বানানো হচ্ছে, questionable female characters নিয়ে অনেক ধরনের movies বানানো হচ্ছে. So motion was about how the motion was saying if we don't like the rise of these kinds of characters and opposition, মানে যারা opposition ছিল ওরা বলতে how they're okay with the rise of these kinds of characters. Is that clear? এখন আমরা ছিলাম opening government, আমরা অনেক ধরনের কথা বলছি about how, sorry, আমরা ছিলাম opening opposition, so আমরা অনেক ধরনের কথা বলছি about how, আমরা ছিলাম opening government. We talked about how these characters are very problematic. We can show the complexities of women with other characters, but there are many other characters that can portray the complexities of being a woman, and we don't necessarily need these particular characters who are actually committing crimes and who are pretty messed up, because then they get misused. People make them an excuse to, like, not like women, blah blah blah. আমাদের closing government এসে বলছে যে okay, all that's true, but what is even truer and what's even more important is the fact that these kinds of movies, they're almost always about a rich white woman. Almost always about a rich white woman and her life. And that's just very alienating to the different kinds of experiences that actually exist in the world for women. Because the majority in the world isn't rich white women. It's actually the opposite. So even if, like, society opposition movies not talk about how these are also important characters, they kind of help women express themselves. They not really express themselves. They make women feel safer. Like, if we allow women to also be seen as bad people, if we allow bad characters to exist, it means that women do not constantly have to feel like they have to be good, they have to be pure, they have to be positive characters, right? That's a burden that we're placing on women. So, another closing documentation was, okay, sure, even if all that's true, even if these are important forms of expression that women should have in popular media, that's still very alienating for the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of women who are not rich white women, whose experiences are very different and only similar cases to their world. So again, like I said, if you think about intersectionality, it's almost like a hack in debating. Just think about whichever marginalized group you're debating on, just think about other layers, just think about other factors within those groups, and that will help you generate a lot of matter. Okay, now, here, I think you need like 15 more minutes. Last. For the notation. What is the media representation? This is a very, very strong argument or very strong notions, Ashik, and the argument we use for example, this house would make James Bond gay, or like this house would make Cinderella a brown princess. So like Disney princesses, we all know Disney princesses, right? Cinderella, Snow White. So this would there are emotions that are like, okay, we would make them brown. So why is it important? Why is it so important?
So that everyone can see.
Yeah, everyone can see. But to be more inclusive, but can you break it down a bit? Because we just keep using these words. Inclusive, everyone can see.
Because of the fact that they were previously so white-centric, I think bringing these people represents that they would be in the same position as them.
Yeah, so it's like normalizing the fact that other groups of people can also be main characters. It's normalizing the fact that, for example, what is associated with gay men? That they're very funny, they're very feminine, they're not masculine at all. So James Bond is a very masculine kind of character, right? So it's like showing or normalizing how different groups of people can also be associated with characters or tropes that are not necessarily what people expect out of them. So it's very important, right? Secondly, Hocche Kumar, power of social movements. Okay. Power of social movements. I think we are running out of time. I have a lot to do, but I will happily return to this. So oftentimes we get lost in the vastness of oppression. So whenever there's a lot of, for example, even in the case of Gaza, there was just so much bloodshed. There was so much depth that at one point it almost became, a lot of people started stopped talking about it because it just felt very pointless. Like, because everyone's talking about it, nothing is being done about it. So, like, what's the point? A lot of people who were speaking up on it, like in 2023, 2024, I noticed that in 2025, a lot less people kept talking about it because it's not that people didn't care about it, it's just that it felt very helpless. And the thing is, we often underestimate the power of incremental changes. What does incremental mean? Step by step. We really underestimate the power of step by step. So even July Revolution, incremental change. So what are the key steps to July Revolution or around 2 days? Okay. Usually people start up with 2018 road safety movement, right? Road safety movement is at one point seemed like it could have been the July Revolution. It was getting pretty widespread, a lot more people were joining in on it, and after a point, it's going to be the July Revolution. That will come army, severe work job person. Actually went to the house of one of my friends, and we're about to imprison them. So after everyone knows about what happened in 2018 road safety movement, COVID digital security acted through things. Only activists, photographers, reporters went to jail for this. Only activists, reporters went to jail for this. And sure, it was not widespread, but important for example, shooting cloud, who have a lot of international cloud, or the against the Digital Security Act. That way, the Quota movement, movement will start with, then it went into a regime change. So, incremental changes are actually important. Even for Gaza, there were 3 ceasefires, and the killings were not entirely stopped. But at least the severity or the gravity is so much, thankfully, less now. And like, even though it feels very helpless and hopeless to talk about these things, just think about it. Even if there's like 5 fewer people getting killed, that's like 5 human beings that get to live life. So, just because something isn't a revolution, just because something isn't turned into a full-blown agro-system change to a China and moved on, does not mean that they are unsuccessful or does not mean that they are not important. They're often very important, especially because incremental changes often lead to the last step, often lead to the last nail in the coffin. So, protest file, activation for anti-protest file, even anti-colonial movement classes all over the world. They are almost always the result of incremental social movement or protest or rebellion, especially in the continent. And if you guys, unfortunately, we don't get the credit that we deserve, but getting rid of the British, Bengal had a huge role in this, because Bengal is agricultural output, and our farmers were we are all farmers, we come from generations of farmers. So our land management and Bengal was the reason why Kolkata was such a hub for British colonials is because a lot of them had to be stationed there. Because Bengal used to see so many rebellions consistently throughout the years. So usually to appreciate, even if you look at other colonial histories, it's often the result of many protests, then act of final which are required, then so incremental changes are very important. Lastly, microaggressions. Okay, this is the last topic. What does microaggressions mean? Small aggressions. What do they look like?
Very snarky comments, very
Jokes. So, major activities So, I'm a major experience. So, it's jokes about practices, about idols, even positive remarks. So, I've heard at many points in my life that Hindu people happen to be more intelligent. Right? That's just a weird form. The reason why that is still a form of microaggression is because it's a form of otherism. Like otherism, like it's just distinguishing yourself or separating yourself from a group. Like you're making another group feel separate from you. You're another group, I am another group, you have different characteristics, I have different characteristics, we are separate, we are like different groups of people. So even seemingly positive traits are still forms of microaggression. Jita, I want to say, remember fetishization much earlier into the class. Fetishization may seem like a positive kind of behavior. That it's not. It is a negative form of behavior because fetishization is not true admiration. It's a form of dehumanization. So these are all microaggressions. Now, how do you, I mean, debaters say often making maybe because you are not able to relate, which is fine. You're not able to relate to a lot of things. Microaggressions impact what the child. So they say like, oh, hate crimes and then microaggressions. And that's it. That's done. But by the way, there's so much you can do with microaggressions. Does anyone want to try at impacting microaggressions? I'm looking at the more experienced pages.
If you use signaling effect, signaling effect that it's normalized or it's okay to show a
Okay, great. Okay, good. That's great. Can you give me examples of microaggression? Like scenarios.
It's harder to systematically kind of put variants on some behaviors because they're not big enough for you to restrict.
Okay, that's also good. I'm going to actually illustrate instruction. Option. So it's like, for example, someone, and this often comes up in affirmative action debates. You guys know what affirmative action is? Affirmative action? Affirmative action? One word, one line.
So basically, it's like favoring the people who are not previously favored.
Previously disadvantaged ওদেরকে এখন একটু favor করা so that we equalize the playing field. Okay? So affirmative action debates অনেক আসে যে the people who are being favored now, they will be ওদের against microaggression. But what then? The microaggression for the equal. So it's just these are still like words. What do they mean? So it's like you feel less confident in meetings. You probably don't want to raise your hand because you constantly feel like you're just there because you're a woman or maybe because you're a minority. Because people have made you feel like you're not there for your qualifications, but it's just because of factors that you couldn't control. You could feel discouraged to join after work activities like hangouts and going to different places or weekend activities. Or it might very well be that you are actually included from after work activities or weekends at time for hangouts hard, but you might actually not be assigned work. So are you to keep being about it? And then your boss was like, oh yeah, sure, just include that person. So it's a very tokenistic form of inclusion. It's not true inclusion. You don't actually get to use your qualifications. So you just don't feel like productive, a very confident, and a very capable person. So this is how you can impact microaggression. And also artificial microaggression.
It's harder.
Oh yeah. So that is also another form of impacted. The artificial, the reason why I'm bringing this up, the reason why I have something written and that match with this. Oftentimes debaters were microaggression and then they stop it. But the thing is, just because just because in the Christ school, you see microaggressions and you probably don't see a lot of hate crimes. So you know what hate crimes are, right? Hate crimes are outright criminal acts against some form of groups or marginalized communities. So even if you don't see a lot of hate crimes, you just see microaggressions a lot more often. That does not mean that it will stay like that. Oftentimes, microaggressions could be a precursor to more violent acts. So microaggressions could be, for example, it could be a signaling effect. So it could signal to people that, I am crossing the line at the group and no one's telling me anything. So I can definitely cross the line a bit more. So just because the current state is cool, microaggressions are what we are seeing more often and probably not hate crimes does not mean that they cannot transform or lead into hate crimes if things are not done about it. So, for example, even though Asians, they're often considered model minorities, but even model minorities, which is often seen as a way of positive discrimination, they're seen as positive. They're like, well, they're trained child. They're seen as more hardworking. They're seen as more intelligent. That is still a form of discrimination because you're otherizing them. You're seeing them as a separate, different kind of group. So Asians, they're very quickly, almost overnight, during COVID there was a serious fight in anti-Asian hate crimes. So, and then you might be wondering, how is that possible? Because they were considered the good people. They were considered the ideal. People wanted their children to be like Asian kids. But realize this, even this kind of positive discrimination is problematic because you're otherizing them and it can very well lead into something very, very negative. So microaggression can lead into hate crimes. So I have exercises, but I don't think we have the time for that. Do you have time? Do you guys have the time?
Wrap it up.
Acha, can I make this for what is it called? Like a rapid fire round. I'm just going for someone just give me an example. Sorry, someone give me a reason for it.
What do you mean by reason?
Reason, like why is this like a issue? Definitely, exactly, opposite issue has, and what are the issue? Okay, well, quick, 5. Yes, action. Raise your hand. Whoever feels confident. Yes. Jordan.
Because they weren't seeing a lot of money
Right.
so they take care of it, they use it.
Exactly. When you have something less, like when you have fewer, but when you have something in a smaller quantity, but it is very important for your livelihood, isn't it likely that you will be very careful with it, right? Okay. Why what is this mean? But and then like আমি একটু কনটেক্সট দিই oftentimes যখনই কোনো মোশন থাকে about doing something for a marginalized community, some kind of step, some kind of action, some kind of policy, অনেকে বলে যে no, we should not do this because minorities will face backlash and that's bad and that's harmful for them. But sometimes it's just not harmful. And like, how could that be the case? Interesting that.
The back is symmetry on both sides of the world, right?
What if it increases your load?
The peculiarity is much more.
Okay, after what you're waiting, because what you're always waiting. So even if there is some kind of policy, some kind of action or some kind of change that might create some like positive outcome, but also might open them up to some form of backlash. What he's saying is that even though মানে ওরা যেহেতু positive outcome না পাচ্ছে, that backlash is fine. But আরেকটা যেটা আমি perspective share করি, like whenever I see something troubling for my community, my parents are a lot more unbothered than me. And the reason for this is because they have just seen a lot more of it.
Desensitized.
Exactly. When someone sees something or experiences something consistently throughout their lives, it's fine if it increases a little bit because they're just somewhat desensitized to it already. Does that make sense? Okay. Why is this?
Since they're already like very people number,
Yeah.
they don't care about their culture.
They do care about their culture. Why? Why?
Because there's a more physical threat to it being erased or
Okay.
by other.
Yeah. Or also, খুবই simple ভাবে. Like, আমরা হচ্ছে
They don't care who's in it.
Huh?
Because their culture is what makes them minorities.
Their culture is what makes them minorities. আচ্ছা, ঠিক আছে। But I just wish হচ্ছে মানে এটা what is the gene?
They don't care the culture of it.
Yeah, it's like a gene. Like even if it happened to not be a big part of their identity, because they face so much discrimination on the basis of it, they just happen to become very obstinate about it. They're like, no, now I will make this a part of it. And this actually is something that happens with the Indian and the brown diaspora in Western countries. So they faced
Also, it's probably like all the smaller spaces where they do feel like accepted and equal in their own culture. So
Yes.
that sense can also be like, oh, I feel equal, yeah, I feel equal.
Yeah.
Because somehow
Yes.
that's the advantage.
So আমি যে এক্সাম্পল দিচ্ছিলাম যে ব্রাউন যে ডায়াসপোরা মানে ইমিগ্রেন্ট ফ্যামিলিজ এন্ড ইমিগ্রেন্ট যারা থাকে ওয়েস্টার্ন কান্ট্রিজে you will often see them celebrating and proudly owning up to their identity a lot more than us. We just don't talk about being brown, being Bangladeshi, but you will see American Bangladeshis, you will see like British Bangladeshis talk a lot more about being Bangladeshi, Bangladeshi food, Bangladeshi culture. And the reason for this is because they have spent so many years of their lives being digital for it. You know, after a certain point, when they felt like they could start being proud about it, now they're just way, like they're really, really proud about it. They're really proud, they're really expressive about it. So see, but again, this session, I mean, I think I'll end here. The session, the reason why I'm taking this session is not to tell you guys that there are some truths and there are some lies. That's not what I was trying to do. What I just tried to do is that there are many different kinds of perspectives. I just tried to make sure that you are able to view or you are able to maybe change the lens a bit more when it comes to viewing groups or trying to understand or talk about groups that you probably don't or cannot directly relate to. Even if you don't have the exact perspectives that they have, the things, the experiences that they undergo, it's still like you can still place yourself in their shoes. You can still assume for a second. You don't need to assume to be there for a second. Sorry, it's just that you can have different kinds of perspectives, and you can have reasons to prove those perspectives. That's all I tried to do throughout this session. I don't know if I'm massively over time or not, but I think I'll end my session here. Thank you so much for